Hello and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. As we record, the Israel Defense Forces have begun their ground invasion into the heart of Gaza City. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Gazans have fled the fighting southward, but hundreds of thousands more remain in the city. The operation is proceeding despite the opposition of defense officials and widespread skepticism alongside outright objection among the Israeli public, and ongoing angry reactions, criticism, and sanctions around the world. The degree of diplomatic isolation that Israel is experiencing has led to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declaring that the country must be more autonomous and self-sufficient in a way he controversially described as a, quote, super Sparta. In the United States, American Jews are having to deal with the ramifications of the behavior of the Netanyahu government in tandem with the turmoil at home caused by the increasingly authoritarian direction of the Donald Trump White House. One place where these issues intersect and are leaving U.S. Jews in a particularly challenging position are Trump's actions billed as punishing universities who permit anti-Semitism on campus. My guest today on the podcast, Professor Lila Corwin Berman, is among a group of Jewish studies academics who are taking a strong stand which, on its face, goes against their own self-interest. She laid out her position in a piece published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, provocatively titled, "Jewish Studies Scholars, Beware! Trump's deal will corrupt you. We must all resist being turned into court Jews." Professor Corwin Berman and I will talk about that piece, as well as other challenges facing U.S. Jewry as everyone looks ahead to a new Jewish New Year. Our conversation coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Professor Lila Corwin Berman is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History from New York University, specializing in political history and Jewish communal institutions, and she is the director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History. Professor Lila Corwin Berman, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
You write in your piece, together with your colleagues Kate Rosenblatt and Ronit Stahl, that, quote, "Fueling Jewish studies on the fumes of the Trump administration's attack on higher education is not a win. It's a trap, and one we fear will bring ill consequences to our field, our universities, and American Jews." So let's try to unpack and explain that. Can you begin by setting the stage for us? Tell us about the ways in which the Trump administration has targeted universities over allegations of civil rights violations, and specifically when it comes to anti-Semitism. Obviously, we're all familiar with how it started after October 7th, the huge demonstrations, encampments, disruptions, in some cases occupying of university buildings in protest of Israel's war in Gaza. So can you talk about that and how that controversy intersected with Trump's overall hostility to institutions of higher education?
That last part you said kind of is the story, I think. Certainly, there were lots of concerns about some of the behaviors and some of the speech on campuses in the wake of October 7th. Lots of debate about what was legitimate protest, what was excessive, what was hateful. Efforts under the Biden administration, efforts by university administrators to think that through, and lots of mistakes in all sorts of directions. Then there has been the dimension of it that has been incredible political grandstanding and the desire to use what happened on campuses, not as a way to think about how should universities do better, be better places where a vast range of ideas can be explored, but instead as really pretense to attack universities and to attack what is called wokeism. And that's really, I think, where this administration, not on its own, things like Project Esther, which is an outgrowth of Project 2025, which is really the roadmap for the Trump administration from the Heritage Foundation, really set this out, that this is a way to attack universities. In other words, to use the allegations of anti-Semitism as a kind of wedge to get into the internal governance of universities, to get into hiring and firing, personnel decisions, to get into policy and disciplinary issues, to get into curricular matters. And that is really what we have seen play out. I think it's possible to say that, around the edges, there maybe is some legitimate concern about what happened on campuses. But I think that the heart of what we have seen in the Trump administration orders having to do with anti-Semitism, and also the piece, that the anti-DEI stuff plays into this, is an effort simply to attack universities. And this makes sense because universities are places where lots of powerful people and ideas are scrutinized. And that is not something that this administration is interested in.
Can you tell us about how federal grant money is being used as a weapon to pressure the universities about the settlements that universities have made regarding how to fight anti-Semitism and the inclusion of Jewish studies in these settlements?
Federal administration has all sorts of means to make sure that institutions that receive federal funding are adhering to civil rights law. And that's been the case since the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The means is investigation. So there are bodies within the Department of Education, for example, for Title VI, which is what most of these cases fall under of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There are bodies that open investigations, can really do thorough explorations of what a case might be that perhaps was in violation of the Civil Rights Act, and then can require institutions to make changes. And there's nothing unusual about that. That is a process that has happened over and over and over since the 1960s. And that is the enforcement mechanism for Title VI, certainly, of the Civil Rights Act. And then there can be litigation and other tools that are used. But things like DEI offices, in fact, have been an outgrowth of those kinds of investigations. So in other words, a conclusion being that hostility toward a group of students on campus means that those students should have more resources, means that there should be more trainings and opportunities for people to learn about the differences that different students come to campus with, or whatever the case might be. It has rarely, I can think of only very, very few cases, happened that the government has gone through that full investigative process and the process of giving recommendations to a university and then checking in on those recommendations, and then has decided to suspend grants, right? That is so unusual, and it is not really something that has been pursued without an entire process. This administration is not interested in what process has been in the past. And it just immediately went from sort of 0 to 60 and took the ultimate measure of, without even any kind of full investigation or process, suspending grants and preemptively suspending grants, right? Suspending grants on just, the fact that somebody had raised concerns, right? And so that is an incredibly powerful tool that is probably not really legal, but it might not matter at this point. And that then put universities in the position where those grants, which are very important to research that they do, which are important to students that come on various grants, from underrepresented backgrounds or from underprivileged backgrounds. And universities have had to respond very quickly. And so it backed them into a corner of needing to respond quickly. And generally speaking, when people have to make those kinds of very, very quick responses and concessions, what happens is not good.
So your piece refers to settlements in 2 Ivy League universities, Columbia University committing in their settlement to appoint new faculty members with joint positions in both the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and the departments of Economics, Political Science, or the International Public Affairs School, and Brown University promising to foster new research and education about Israel and a robust program in Judaic studies, as well as renewed partnerships with Israeli academics. Presumably, Jewish scholars might cheer this. Great. What's the harm in strengthening Jewish studies? But you write that the Trump deals threaten to topple everything that Jewish studies has achieved. So you fear that because of these deals, Jewish studies will lose status as respected fields of academic inquiry?
I don't think it's just status. It's actual legitimacy. So to be told, for universities to be told, first of all, that they need to make certain curricular decisions and allocate resources for this priority and not a different priority, that in and of itself is a real federal overreach into the governance of universities. And that's incredibly concerning. And so I don't think that it is a benefit to anybody in a university to be living in a place where the government is telling people what they should be studying in university or what they shouldn't be studying. So that already, in my mind, raises a lot of questions, not about the legitimacy per se of Jewish studies, but just about any group that might be benefiting on campus from this at another point is going to not be benefiting, right? It doesn't behoove anybody in a university to have the government making these kinds of decisions about what should or shouldn't be studied. But more so than that, the idea that Jewish studies is being figured as a kind of remedy to anti-Semitism on campus, right? Or allegations of anti-Semitism on campus, that in other words, its purpose is being defined as being able to make some kind of outcome where what this administration is deciding is anti-Semitic, which we should be very aware of the fact is really much of what it sees as leftism, as radical leftism, as wokeism, as really liberalism, right? So it's sort of defining all of that stuff in the bucket of anti-Semitism, that Jewish studies is somehow in the position of being the remedy to that. And an interesting little piece of evidence that has come out since we wrote the piece is that recently it was announced that the NEH gave a pretty massive, I think the largest grant ever, to the Tikva Foundation, which is a Jewish organization that is right of center, that has funded things like Tablet, that has lots of different fellowships it provides for students, and is very much committed in its material sort of explicitly to the quote unquote Western canon. And I think that the idea that those are the kinds of like good Jewish studies, the Jewish studies that endorses a sort of Western centric, Western civilization model that is very palatable to white Christian conservative vision of the United States, that is about channeling Jewish studies to a very, very particular narrative and using it, instrumentalizing it as a kind of pawn in that ideology. And yeah, there's some dimension of Jewish studies that in a rigorous, scholarly based way can be part of how people talk about Western civilization. And then there are lots of parts of Jewish studies in a rigorous, scholarly based way that do not necessarily fuel that narrative. But it's very clear that what this administration is doing in these settlements is understanding Jewish studies in that instrumental way to serve a very particular purpose, which is not about kind of free academic scholarship or inquiry, but is really about serving a particular kind of master. And I think that that is deeply, deeply dangerous for universities, for Jewish studies, and for American Jews.
Have you gotten pushback on your position from your colleagues or the American Jewish community saying, how can you be discouraging of more support for Jewish and Israel studies in embattled university environments?
Not as much as I thought we would get. Maybe people are just tired or feel sending out their rage or sense of outrage or whatever in other directions. I did hear from one person who basically said, so are you saying that Jewish studies should just walk away from these positions and, just say no, thank you and not comply at all? I think that what we tried to say, although it was sort of a short part in a relatively short article, is that Jewish studies had no voice or choice in any of this. So we tried to make it very clear that we are not blaming our colleagues, right? We are friends and colleagues with people at all of these institutions. And by the way, there are other institutions, not because of direct federal deals with the Trump administration, but because of legal settlements that are sort of in the same position, right? Where, one of the outcomes of a lawsuit is, some kind of channeling of resources to enrich Jewish studies. So, these are not decisions or choices that Jewish studies is involved in. And I think that the responsibility of Jewish studies is to now take the conditions as they exist and make good decisions about it. And so instead of following the playbook and saying, okay, we'll just hire people to do Jewish studies, and we're good and not look around us, think about how can these positions or these resources help add value to the university as a whole? How can they really build meaningful bridges with other departments and disciplines and actually, kind of counterbalance the attack on universities? One person who did reach out to me said, well, that's well and good, but nobody in their right mind is going to take this money and hire a leftist faculty member. And that's precisely the problem, right? If the idea of this is it somehow comes with a litmus test, that you can study things, that fuel that kind of Western civilization narrative. But if you're somebody who has different theoretical ideas or different sources or different methods, then you should not be hired. Like, that proves the real potential illegitimacy of these deals.
You argue in your piece in kind of a counterintuitive way that going along with the Trump program to fight anti-Semitism on campus may fuel anti-Semitism. Can you talk about that?
If one studies the different dynamics of anti-Semitism historically, it's not just been the case that the way that this phenomenon works is that Jews are targeted always with, vicious attacks or with, being just reviled or cast out. There are dimensions of anti-Semitism that are about sort of exceptionalizing Jews, right? And treating them as a special category from whom special services or favors can be extracted. We kind of reference the idea of the court Jew, which is precisely that, like the idea of the good Jew, of the Jew who can sort of be brought into the orbit of power and then can be useful, right? And there are multiple problems with that. One is that it can fuel resentment from other groups, right? And so, to just bring it home to campuses, like the idea that in this environment of incredible austerity, when lots of universities have lost grant funding from the federal government, not just the big headline elite ones, but really every university is suffering from that. And when universities are planning with the presumption that they're just going to have fewer and fewer resources, right? And so positions are being cut, programs are being cut. It's not good. And that then this, one particular unit is like getting money from the Trump administration, right? This is not going to necessarily cause goodwill between different programs in Jewish studies. So that's, like one dimension of it is just the resentment and the unfortunate way in which, like, psychologically, it can cause people to sort of displace the feelings of anger and upsetness that they have onto this kind of exceptionalized, favored for a moment sort of Jew, right? So that's one piece of the dynamic. But the other is that what we learn from the history of this sort of like exceptional Jew or Jew figure is that just as a kind of powerful figure might at one moment decide to provide favor in this exceptional way, sort of out of any normal channels or process, that can very easily flip to disfavor. Right. And so if that court Jew steps out of line, right, if that leftist faculty member is hired with that, quote unquote leftist, right, whatever that might mean, with that money from a settlement, like the favor becomes an iron fist. And it can cause, incredible retribution that is, historically, we know can cause lots and lots of problems for Jews, not just those who had been close to power, but also beyond that.
And with all of the attacks by the administration on diversity programs and anti-discrimination measures, there's also a danger that it seems like anti-Semitism will be the only kind of racism that's allowed to be recognized and countered.
Right. And I had written a piece in the spring, I think it was on MSNBC.com, about the irony of an administration, on one hand, trying to completely dismantle DEI programs and offices on university campuses, and then at the same time talk about how it's going to strengthen its powers to combat anti-Semitism on campus. Because one has to understand, whatever else DEI might mean in the sort of like swirl of discourse, DEI is synonymous with the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The entire kind of bureaucratization of DEI on campuses or corporations or wherever it might be, the fact that there are offices with that name, that is about compliance to statutes of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, yes, of course, there's lots of other dimensions of how people talk about DEI, and, you know, there's a kind of rhetorical piece of it, but the actual offices were established because of that process I talked about earlier, right? Because universities being investigated for civil rights violations and being told by the different federal officers who are doing the investigation, here are the kinds of proactive measures that you could take so that you are making sure that you have a hospitable learning environment for all of your students and for all of your faculty and so on and so forth. And the creation and the funding of DEI offices came out of that. And the idea that the same administration that was deciding to dismantle all of this, which is an attack not just on DEI, but it's an attack on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's an attack on anti-discrimination law, is somehow going to also be able to be this champion of fighting anti-Semitism is really quite ludicrous. And again, it is about this kind of exceptionalizing of the Jew and of anti-Semitism, as if different measures and different laws can or should be used in order to combat it, which, as I said before, has the potential energy in it to flip, right? And to exceptionalize, but in a way that could be deeply, deeply harmful for Jews.
Lila, I can't resist asking you, since you are on one of the most prominent and politicized campuses in the country at NYU, all eyes are always on New York. It's the beginning of the 2025-2026 academic year, nearly 2 years after October 7th, when the campuses were on fire. The war is still wearing on. It's even intensifying as we speak. The ground invasion of Gaza City is happening. How would you characterize the atmosphere on campus? Is there still any kind of focus on Israel, Gaza, the Palestinians, or has Trump's election brought the focus to the fights at home?
It's very hard to extrapolate from just the small slice of campus life that one sees. You know, I have sort of said throughout all of this that what I see among my students, and when I walk through campus, and I was partially on faculty at Temple University in Philly during all of this, and then, as you said, at NYU, I generally see students who are curious and who want to understand really complicated historical and political forces that they, you know, don't totally understand, and they want to be able to ask questions, and in some cases are sort of scared of asking questions because they don't want to sort of say something that might be offensive to somebody or might show that they don't understand all the dynamics going on. And so I think that by and large, the biggest loss of this whole era has been that this was an incredible opportunity for students to ask a lot of questions about the world around them, and that for lots of different reasons that was shut down. And I think it continues to be the case that students want to be able to talk about these things without, quote unquote, taking a side, right? They feel as if they want to learn what's going on. I think that many of them are very horrified by the images that they see coming out of Gaza, and they want to understand what is going on. And, you know, I think that the space to do that has narrowed. I do think that, you know, there still are certainly students who are protesting what Israel's doing. And there are, you know, I have seen different pro-Palestinian demonstrations continuing sometimes on campus. And I think that there are some students who are feeling as if they want to be defending Israel. And I have seen expressions of that on campus. I think that a lot of what is happening on campuses now, though, is a real sense, at least among faculty, of concern about where our own government is going right now, and the ways in which the crackdown on universities may be foreshadowing the crackdown on broader realms of speech, criminalizing speech. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of concern about that for sure. I don't have like a balcony view of everything that's going on campus, but I think it's not a good time, really. And the most that I feel like we as faculty can try to do is provide as many outlets and spaces where students can really explore and ask questions and, still feel as if they are allowed to ask hard questions and not be scared of that.
Lila, finally, we cover the reactions of American Jews, of American Jewish institutions to what's happening here in Israel at Haaretz every single day. You are one of the premier scholars of the history of Jewish communal institutions. I was really fascinated over the past week by the remarks and the reactions to the remarks of the actress Hannah Einbinder after she said "Free Palestine" at the Emmys and was asked about it. Her slogans weren't new, but what really interested me was when she said, quote, "As a Jewish person, she needs to distinguish Jews from the state of Israel because our religion and our culture is such an important and longstanding institution that is really separate from this sort of ethno-nationalist state." Now, the slice of American Jewry that I grew up in involved American Jews building their identity so much around Israel. Many of their connections with the religion itself were loose. Their connection to Israel was very tight. And here we've got young, very secular American Jew trying to be protective of her religion and culture and saying it has to be protected from the modern state of Israel. As a historian of American Jewish communal life, what kind of a moment do you see us being in when statements like that are, part of our mainstream culture?
It's definitely a kind of transition. I think you're right to note a sort of generational change. There were these sort of important sociological theories of American Judaism starting in the 60s and 70s that really said that the two poles of American Judaism were the memory of the Holocaust and a connection to Israel, right? And that became sort of like the baseline of not only descriptively what American Jewish life was kind of tethered by, but also sort of prescriptively, it became the basis for American Jewish education and identity building, that these were these two facets to use. Now, it's worth noting that even in the kind of heyday of that construct of thinking like these are the poles of American Judaism, there were different levels of criticism. So certainly, there were some scholars, rabbis, public intellectuals who said that there's something superficial because neither of these poles are actually sort of the real possession of American Jews. It's sort of vicarious. That was one level of criticism. And it's important to note that there were certainly voices throughout this period that were very critical of American Jews having this kind of connection to Israel, who were talking about Palestinian rights, and we're thinking about the kinds of conflicts of political power and supremacy and everything else in Israel. And so, it's not as if there was no contestation, but it's certainly the case that those two poles were kind of clear tethers of American Jewish identity. And I think that it makes sense that these things change over time. In fact, it would be really strange if they didn't. Obviously, when it comes to Holocaust memory, the fact that there are very, very few living survivors of the Holocaust at this point in time, and just the passage of time, other things happening in the world, means that kind of Holocaust memory does not provide the same sort of thickness of identification for American Jews, even if many of them continue to learn about it and certainly care a great deal about it. And when it comes to the state of Israel, I think that part of the depth of identification that American Jews felt with Israel was about a kind of sense that American liberalism and Israeli liberalism had this deep connection. And that was not fostered only by the connection of Jews, but it was also sort of part of statecraft. And, there were lots of efforts among Israeli state leaders and American state leaders to sort of have that meeting of the minds, that these are these two sort of bastions of liberalism, especially in the Cold War context, that was very, very important. And I think there have always been questions about just how deep American liberalism is, and certainly how deep Israeli liberalism is. In the last 20 or so years, with the kind of steady power of the right in Israel, And with the growth of settlements and with conflicts in not just the West Bank, but also in Gaza, and now the latest, I think that it's not surprising that that bridge of liberalism has really, if not entirely fallen, at least, really crumbled a lot. And so I think that many younger American Jews who don't have memories of any other sort of different governmental official voice coming out of the state of Israel than the right-wing one, don't really have any of that visceral identification. I think that there has just been more public awareness of the treatment of Palestinians and some effort also to sort of draw analogies between the mistreatment of Palestinians by Israelis and the mistreatment of other groups in the United States by American powers. And so those critiques sort of coming together, that both of these liberalisms have had some sort of falsity to them. So it's not surprising. And one thing I think that you note, Allison, which I think is really, really important, is it's not just younger Jews saying, I feel alienated from Israel or I don't feel connected, but actually saying that my sense of Jewish identity compels me to speak out against what Israel is doing, because I think that it's harmful to the ideals, the values of Judaism and what they mean to me. And that's something that I think is really, really striking. I had a young person the other day tell me that he was interested in learning Hebrew, and he was somebody who'd grown up Jewish, but very, very secular. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because when he's been going to, he's a Jewish kid, when he's been going to some of the protests against Israel, and people have been using liturgical Hebrew songs, sort of summer camp songs, whatever the case might be. And this has been a real way that the Jews who are protesting what the Israeli government is doing have found a sense of unity in those songs. And he doesn't have that. He wants to have that because he realizes that this is a part of his Judaism. So in other words, the protests against Israel being the kind of route, the avenue for this person to really explore his connection to Judaism, to liturgy, to prayer, to song. So I thought that was really fascinating and sort of illustrates, I think, a comment that you had made.
A very interesting road to your Jewish roots to take. Professor Lila Corwin Berman speaking to us from New York University. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on our podcast.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thanks to my guest, Professor Lila Corwin Berman, and to producer Avi Rosenzweig and editor Maya Ben Nissan. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast, make sure you never miss an episode. Please subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can leave us a 5-star rating so more people can find us. Also, to keep up with all of the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.